Once again we have two writers that, though they may share some. Once again, we have a contrast in two writers between Dylan Thomas and our other poem for between Dylan Thomas. Once again, we have a contrast of poets between Dylan Thomas and Stevie Smith. Stevie Smith was a little bit older than Dylan Thomas. She was born in 1902. She had Stevie Smith had a bit of a rougher go as a child. Her father was a shipping agent who inherited his business from his father, Stevie Smith's grandfather, and then ran it into the ground. And then because of the failure of and then because of his shame over his failure to and then possibly because of a combination between his shame that he lost his father's business and just a need to make money and earn a living in the first place, he became somewhat of a merchant marine and essentially lived the rest of his life at sea. He basically abandoned Stevie Smith and the family. He basically abandoned his family and Stevie Smith. After her father left, she and her older sister and her mother went to live with her aunt, and she would basically live in that house in that city for the rest of her life. Stevie Smith was a very isolated figure. She is in many ways kind of a 20th century British Emily Dickinson. She almost never went out. She almost never went out. She showed passing romantic interests in people that she met in her life, but was almost never interested in anyone sexually. She loathed the idea of the basic package domestic life that was presented to women. She did not like the idea of having children or keeping house, and she and living in a house with three very strong and independent women kind of presented her with an opportunity to live a life a little bit against the grain. She was altogether now sick as a child, and she was diagnosed early on with tuberculosis. You know your patterns by now. Because of this, in addition to everything else, she was very withdrawn and shy. But then also, a lot like Emily Dickens, she had a very rich life of writing and correspondence. She wrote letters upon letters upon letters. This is what she did primarily in her free time as she worked and made a living for a couple of decades as a private secretary. It was the kind of job that allowed her to be alone and spend a lot of time with herself, and gave her a lot of time to write on the side, and gave her a lot of inspiration for what would ultimately be her first novel, entitled Novel on Yellow Paper, which was released in 1936 and was critically acclaimed and was a tremendous commercial success. This was 13 years into her career as a secretary. Because of the huge success of a novel on yellow paper, the next year she published her first, sort of riding high on the success of a novel on yellow wallpaper. The next year, in 1937, she published her riding high on the success of her first novel, riding high on the success of sort of after being sort of encouraged and after after the encouraging success of her After the encouraging success of her first novel, the next year in 1937, she released her first volume of She published her first volume of poetry entitled "A Good Time Was Had by All." As far as anyone can trace, that is the first time anyone has ever. As far as anyone can trace, those are the first times. As far as anyone can trace, that is the first time that phrase was ever published. As far as anyone can trace, that is the first time that phrase was ever published. So you have been quoting Stevie Smith all throughout your life, more than likely. This volume of poetry, much like her novel, was tremendously successful. Gave her a reputation as a very solid and thoughtful writer. She was innovative in a couple of ways. Her poetry sort of had a interesting balance of being completely morbid yet funny. She was a master of dark humor. Or at the very least, darkness added with a sense of levity. Being abandoned by her father, being sick as a child, fighting and having to recover from a disease like tuberculosis meant that she had had many scrapes with death early on in her life, and it was something that was a theme in a lot of her poetry. A tremendous amount of her poetry was written during her time as a board secretary in the 20s and 30s, but as she continued to write through the later of her life, she would be known as a very well. A lot of the work that was published in her first few collections of poetry was work that was written during her time as a board private secretary throughout the 20s and the 30s, up to the publication of her first novel. But then even after that, she had a reputation of just being a very consistently and solidly good writer. She almost never had a period of her life where her poems weren't very well received. She was so successful as a poet that she was able to quit her job as a secretary 20 years into it in 1953. Part of the reason that she doesn't exist in the popular mind as much as someone like Dylan Thomas is likely due to the fact that is likely due to her proclivity toward just sort of staying to herself and keeping herself isolated. Her poetry would grow darker toward the end of her life as she became more preoccupied with her own death. It is toward the end of her life in the 1960s that Not Waving But Drowning was published. As you can tell, Not Waving But Drowning doesn't necessarily have the humor that a lot of her earlier work does. It still has that preoccupation with death, that occupation with isolation and feeling detached from other people. But one of the curious things about her poetry is the fact that it frequently included these illustrations, these little drawings that she would include as a tandem piece or as a compendium, or these little sketches that she would quickly include as oh, there's a cat. Hey, buddy. No, he didn't want to talk to me. Her her poetry her poetry would frequently include these sketches and drawings that she would include as a companion piece to her poems, and that frequently toyed with the common reading of the poems in such a way. And Not Waving But Drowning is one of the more well known of these. I have a little bit of special love for this poem because this is the poem that I wrote my. This poem I have a little bit of extra special personal love for because this is the poem that I wrote about for my exit assessment in grad school. And one of the things that I wrote about it was the fact that. And one of the things that I wrote about it was about the shifting perspective of who we're dealing with. This is a narrative poem written as a limerick, meaning that there are several voices, but they aren't made distinct by anything literary or anything grammatical. where one person, where at one moment we're talking about him, suddenly we're talking about I, and that confusion. And that confusion about who is actually speaking and who is the drowning person versus who are the people talking about the drowning person is intentionally meant to play on this idea of society versus individual. The poem starts out with "Nobody heard him, the dead man, but still he lay moaning. I was much further out than you thought, and not waving but drowning." So in one stanza, the speaker is talking about the dead man as him, and then suddenly switches to talking about the dead person as I. It isn't clear that the I is the dead person until the third stanza, where we hear, "Oh no, it was too cold." We don't know that the I of the first stanza is actually the dead person speaking. We don't know that the I of the third stanza is actually the dead person speaking until after we've gotten through. We don't know that the I. We don't know at the moment. We don't know that the person who says, "I was much farther out than you thought," is the dead person until we've made it through the second and third stanza and had a little bit of understanding about what has happened. The next stanza says, "Poor chap, he always loved larking, and now he's dead. It must have been too cold. It must have been too cold for him. His heart gave way," they say. So the second stanza is clearly all third person. They are talking about the person that they see drowning and that is laying there on the beach, perhaps. But then the third stanza takes the perspective of the dead person. The third stanza takes the perspective of the dead person, takes the perspective of the I again. "Oh no, it was too cold always," except for that parentheses where he says, "Oh no, it was too cold always, still the dead one lay moaning. I was much too far out all my life, and not waving but drowning." So there is intentional confusion about whether or not those who speak of the dead person as third person and the one who speaks of the dead person in the first person may in fact be some way, somehow, the same person, which creates this feeling of everybody speaks of everybody else in terms of how it is presented to them, and yet everybody presents to everybody else a lie about who they are and what kind of shape they're in. If we're meant to treat this poem like a narrative, like the person who says he and the person who says I, as two distinct people, then the poet would logically have indicated that somehow grammatically, because there are ways to do that in language. Since it didn't, we're intentionally invited to sort of break down the wall between those who are seeing and those who are speaking. And it creates a feeling in this poem of whether I'm seeing the person who always loved larking and now misinterpreting the actual events that led to this person's death, and I might be the person whose actions were misinterpreted as they lay there dying and moaning. Then it kind of puts us all in the same boat. We are all walking through life misreading people and being misread by others. And then there's even more confusion in the fact that if the dead person is dead, why are they laying there moaning? They're not even dead. So this is another instance where the people who are observing in the situation just don't have all the facts right. And the person who is laying there moaning and suffering is still not able to communicate with the others and let them know what's really going on. All this time that I made it seem like I loved larking. No. I was drowning that whole time. I wasn't waving at you. I was drowning. And just because I was too far away for you to really be able to tell the difference. But there was a difference and it mattered.